best advice you could give to a person who is starting to write sci-fi? What do they need to know?
It's the same thing it's the same advice I would give to any young writer who's starting to write in a genre, and that is read as much as you can within that genre. Read particularly the early material to make sure that somebody hasn't done something you think is a brilliant new idea 50 years ago. There's nothing more embarrassing than that. So read as much as you can, and the other thing is to write something every day. If you write one page every day, at the end of the year you'll have a novel. Even if it's not a good novel, and even if it's not a good page, you'll get from page 100 to page 356. And if you can do that, then you can go back and rewrite and rework, and you'll have something to be proud of. Because most people who say they want to be writers, the biggest thing they don't do is actually sit down and write.
What if a person wants to get into script writing? What if they want to start writing Hollywood scripts? What advice do you have for them?
Write a book first, because chances are, with very few exceptions, you just can't break in with an original screenplay unless you know somebody. You have a much better chance, if you want to make your own science fiction or fantasy film, of raising the money from your friends, relatives, local lawyers, and doctors. And people have made films this way. Robert Rodriguez is a perfect example, although it wasn't science fiction or fantasy. It's a much easier way to make the movie. You either make it yourself by raising the money and directing it and writing it and producing it yourself, or you write a book that somebody wants to make into a movie. Also, it's much easier to sell a book than it is to sell an original screenplay. Everybody between San Francisco and the Mexican border in the state of California has written a screenplay.
Yes.
And they all want to sell it. That's because Hollywood is Hollywood and everybody wants to be in the movies. And it's because it's easier actually to write a screenplay, I think, than it is to write a novel. There's certainly less work involved, but you have a much better chance of selling a book than you ever do a screenplay. So write the book first, or write the story first at least.
Now, with your history, you were writing books for quite some time, and then Hollywood started to look for you. You didn't look for Hollywood. You didn't have to go to Hollywood, did you?
Well, yes and no. You're probably talking about the first Star Trek movie, which I wrote the story for. I had written 10 books based on the animated Star Trek series. And on the basis of that, Gene Roddenberry knew that I was familiar with the Star Trek universe and the Star Trek characters. And when they started preparing to revive Star Trek as a TV series, they called in a lot of people to present story ideas, and I was one of them. They then decided or determined that they were going to try and open this new series with a 2-hour movie for TV. My story was picked. I was asked to expand it to support 2 hours instead of 1 hour, and then that became the basis for the eventual first film.
Now, what I like about your fantasy series is you're not copying Lord of the Rings over and over again. What advice would you give to a person who wants to write fantasy or sword and sorcery? What do they need to know to really make something original?
When you're starting, it's very difficult because your natural tendency is to do a copy of something that you already like, whether it's Lord of the Rings or C.S. Lewis or H.P. Lovecraft or anybody else. The problem with that is the writing generally turns out to look exactly like that. So what I tell people is if you have a good idea, try to turn it around and turn it upside down and do something different with it. Just like the producers of Alien did when they suddenly decided, essentially at the last minute, to make the principal character a woman instead of a guy, but without changing much of the storyline or the dialogue. It completely changed the tenor of the picture and the story. That doesn't mean you reverse gender on every character in your outline when you're outlining your book. But when you're looking at what you've written, take a second look at it and say, well, now, does this look like something I've already read? And if so, how can I make it different? And that's what I try to do with my fantasy and my science fiction.
Tell us about Human Blend. When can we read it?
The Human Blend will be published by Del Rey in December of this year. And it's the first book of a trilogy called The Tipping Point. The second book is Sick Incorporated, and the third book is The Sum of Her Parts. And without going into too much detail about it, we discussed earlier changes in biotechnology as opposed to what most people think of when they think of hard science fiction. They think of physics and astronomy. I'm also fascinated by the developments in biology and biotechnology. So the book is full of that, and without going into too much detail and giving too much away, let's just say that there's a great deal of cosmetic surgery that goes on that moves way beyond Botox injections and facelifts.
So once again, you are predicting the future.
Well, the idea is in this particular aspect of biotechnology, again, referencing the cultural and the social developments, which is something a lot of science fiction overlooks, although less so now than it did in the 30s and the 40s. What would happen if you could essentially look like anybody you wanted to look like? And not just your face, but what if physically? If everybody can be a 300-pound lineman with a 5.0 60-yard dash, what happens to professional football? Do you look for 500-pound linemen who can do the 60-yard dash in 4 seconds? Where does that sort of thing stop? How does it change our society?
What's brilliant about your idea and why I'm looking forward to reading the book is what if a person decides, I want to look like Tom Cruise?
That's in the book.
Wow.
Well, never mind Tom Cruise. What if you want to look like Marilyn Monroe or Clark Gable? And what happens if all your neighbors can look like Marilyn Monroe and Clark Gable? It's like the two women who show up at the party with the same dress and the same jewelry and the same makeup. Suddenly, nobody's interested in that anymore. So if you can look like Clark Gable, this would be a phase. This will be a phase that people will go through. This will happen. But once everybody's done it, what's the next step? Do you suddenly decide you want to look like Rondo Hatton, for those people who know old films? What's beautiful suddenly becomes ordinary. And if it's ordinary, then what becomes beautiful? And not just visually, but for example, again, without giving too much of the story away, if you're a fireman and that's your career, what happens if they can manipulate your skin so that your skin becomes fireproof? How does this change, the people who supply fireproof suits? What else would a fireman want? What would an opera singer want in the way of a physical manipulation?
And now, I've read a lot of the Myouterspace questions, and they always come down to the same thing, because we have a lot of people who are artists in Myouterspace. That's why they're coming over to your planet, and why we're happy to have you as the Governor of Creatia. And they always want to know the same thing. How do I become a better writer? Where do I get my ideas? Where do you get your ideas? But you and I talked about something earlier, the importance of the quest. And what I like about your books is the hero, the protagonist, he or she always has a quest. Why is the quest so important in sci-fi, in fantasy? Why do you have to have a quest to have a good movie?
People want to be taken on a journey when they go to the movies or when they read a book. They don't really, unless they're philosophy professors who are reading French literature from the 1950s, they really want to go someplace. They want to progress. And particularly with science fiction and fantasy, one of the reasons people read science fiction and fantasy or go to science fiction and fantasy films is because they want to be transported away from their everyday lives and the things they see every day. And one of the best ways to do that is to take your main characters on a quest so that they do go not just personally and internally on a quest to develop themselves, but on a real trip. So that people, when you pick up a science fiction or fantasy novel, you want to go someplace that you can't go by going down to your local travel agent or going online and buying a ticket. You want to go someplace completely new and completely different. The trick is not just to change familiar names and places. It's very easy, for example, to take castles in Germany and make them fantasy castles. If you're going to do something like that, try to do something different with your castle as well as your people. So the whole quest thing involves not only your characters changing and developing, but it's also kind of a triptych. People want to be taken along on a journey. And science fiction and fantasy really do that better than anything else, if you as a reader have any kind of an imagination.
This is Jasen T. Davis signing off from Myouterspace TV with Alan Dean Foster, the Governor of Creatia.